All right, we're a couple minutes past the hour. I want to be respectful of everybody's time who's joined us. I know we'll have a few more folks signing in here as we go, but let's go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us today. I am Jason Dahl. I am a certified financial planner and the director of financial planning services here at AFS. And with me today, remotely of course, is my colleague Al Badabek, the founder and managing partner of AFS. Today, we are going to discuss decluttering your financial life, which, although being one of our newest presentations, has quickly become one of our most popular. Before we get started, just a couple quick reminders that we are recording this session, and we will be sending that recording out by tomorrow, most likely by the end of the day. It takes a little bit of time to download, get it all processed, but we'll also send that recording along with a handout that goes along with this presentation. Lastly, please ask questions at any time during today's session. The best way to do that is by typing them in using the Q&A or the chat box. So you should have a little control panel. You'll see an icon that says Q&A or chat. Either one works. We'll keep an eye out for those. Open that chat box up, type us in a question. We encourage any and all questions at any point. We also want to encourage you to directly follow up with us after this workshop if you have further questions or would like to schedule a time to review a few things over a Zoom call or just a regular old phone call. Now, we love what we do. The best part of what we do is connecting with people and helping you solve personal financial planning puzzles. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So without further ado, let's get going right into decluttering your financial life. Alp, you want to take the first?
Sure. So I'm going to make a distinguishing between like personal records and business records. So if you think about your personal records, other than tax returns and supporting documents, I'll say, and records related to home purchases and home sales and home improvements, there's really no real responsibility to retain records of daily expenditures. And I'm generalizing a bit, but you have to save some things, but I'm a big believer that if I'm walking out of a store or the grocery store and they actually still printed out the receipt, I throw it away. I just don't save any of those things. But when you're talking about business records, there's difference there. So if it's a small business, you're a consultant and you don't have any employees, very little responsibilities there. There'll be some, and we'll go over that a little bit later. But if it's a big business and you have employees, you're incorporated, you generally have a fiduciary responsibility to retain records. And so for the most part, we're going to throw out I'll say a 7-year period for most things, but big difference between personal records and business records. Jason? You're muted, Jason.
Yep. Sorry. Always that little trick of getting yourself unmuted. All right. So paper versus digital. All right. We realize that there are some generational differences, right, when it comes to this debate. The obvious, the younger crowd tends to not even own a printer anymore. We see that a lot. And just take everything to the cloud. Right. I know for myself, I'm a Gen Xer. I kind of feel a little bit of in between, right? On the positive, they say Gen Xers are that generation who can relate and communicate well with both the older generation, right, and the baby boomers and so forth, as well as millennials. On the flip side, I remember it wasn't until high school that I even heard the concept of email. I'll never forget, my sister was living in Mexico at the time, and on a phone call, she was trying to explain to me this whole concept of email, and we could write to each other over the computer. So I didn't grow up with it. So I know a lot of folks kind of think like, oh, you're young enough, you should be really well versed in digital. But gosh, you're old enough to where I didn't grow up we're truly in a digital world. So I've had to kind of transition from being a little bit of both paper and digital over the years, and I'll say personally, I continue to just get more and more to that right side of the screen, right? More and more digital in everything I do. I still have a little filing cabinet at home with some paper in it, but every year it gets smaller and smaller. What's in there? It used to be jam-packed with paper. So honestly, like, avoid filling up those filing cabinets, or just work towards being done with filing cabinets altogether at some point. Now, we are going to talk about there definitely are some things that you want to hang on to in hard copy form, right? Um, and we're also going to talk about how important it is to, kind of have backups of a lot of those things in a digital form, right? But we're going to go into a lot more detail as to, what truly do you need to keep in paper and what can you go to digital, and some best practices on that front. So, but, you want to ask yourself, when storing documents, I think one key question is, how would I recover these files if I needed them after a disaster, right? What if there was a fire in your house, a flood in your house, right? Any kind of disaster, again, back to that, having a digital backup, right? Of even things that you say, I'm just not comfortable going 100% digital here, have a digital backup of it, right? It's a really, really good kind of frame of mind to get into. It obviously can save a lot of space. I know for in our office, we moved offices about 7 years ago, right, Al?
It is, yeah.
And at the time, the old office, we had a wall of filing cabinets. But before we had moved, we had we'd scanned in and digitized everything, and then shredded all the paper copies. And we got rid of, I think, all of them. I don't think we moved a single one of our filing cabinets to the new office, right?
And we couldn't get rid of them.
Nobody and we couldn't get rid of. Nobody wanted them. We thought, oh, we'll donate these, or well, first I think somebody thought, oh, we'll sell them. No one wants to buy them. And we thought, can we donate them? Nobody even wanted them. But then also just the ease of finding documents, right? Once you make that commitment to digital, with some basic training. I know some of you are saying, I don't need training on digital, right? But others say, hey, I need to get a little oriented. Boy, it makes your life so much easier to just find things, say, oh, hey, I need to send this to my tax person, right? Or, having a lot of in digital form can really make life a lot easier. I'll also just kind of share, right, in going back a year ago, right, when the whole world got kind of turned upside down, everybody got sent home to work remotely. I remember Alp and I sharing with our team, thinking like, okay, we'll probably see you back here in 2 to 3 weeks. Well, here we are 12 months later, coming up on that 1-year anniversary really soon. One of the great things in hindsight that we had done without even knowing, right, that we were going to have a pandemic and, right, be sent home, was our team had gone through preparations for, well, what if our building burned to the ground, right? Or what if there was an earthquake, right? And we couldn't get into our office. Could we still continue our operations, right? Could we still be able to service our clients and get our work done? And we'd kind of gone through a mock preparation of saying, hey, everybody, do you have what you need? Do you know what you would need to do if we had to work remotely? And so for us, it turned out being a really easy, smooth transition. So I got to give a big shout out to Olivia on our team. So anybody who's worked with us, who knows Olivia, how great she is, she had us well prepared to do this.
And I know at times when we're talking about digital and the younger generation, one of the things that to us really is fascinating, the differences. So if Jason and I are working with a younger couple and we say, we need this, and this from you. And if we're I'll say back in the days, it was a face-to-face meeting. It's funny how many times they'll just pick up their phone and, oh yeah, I just sent it to you. Compared to my generation where somebody basically says, yeah, I have to go home, find it, and then I'll send it to you. Even though I'll admit these days, almost everybody sends everything to us in a scanned format, as opposed to the old days, we'd get a lot of things, with envelopes. And as the senior member of the crew, I can attest that once you buy into the paperless preferences at times, whether it's utility statements, investment statements, it just makes organizing your financial life a lot easier. So just, if you're hesitant, I'm going to just point out, it makes it that much easier.
Yeah. Alp has converted.
As best as I can, I'll say. So when it comes to home records, so the one thing you need to remember, that selling a property is a reportable transaction on your tax return. So you have to have records of what you've paid for the property, and obviously in the year you sell it, it's easy, you'll have the settlement sheet from when you sold it, but you have to support what's called your cost basis of the property. So things you need to keep when it comes to homes, the settlement sheets for purchases and refinances. And there are times that people have had the same home for 30 years. They might have refinanced it 5 times. And on each of those refinances, there are expenses that will get added to the cost basis of your property. When you sell a property, it's reportable on IRS Form 2119. And so if you've sold a house in prior years, and I'll tell you on the next slide that I'll say, oh, you have to keep tax records for 7 years, but you actually want to keep the IRS Form 2119 from the last sale of your house. So, if you sold a house in 1994 and you're throwing away some old tax records, you want to pull out that 1994 2119 form. So home title, the deed, records of home improvements, and this is different than home repairs, but if you've actually, I always tell you, like, walk around the house, think of things that you did that changed the house. If you put up window treatments, if you put insulation in the house, put a new roof on it, put a fence, landscaping, but not, I'll call it maintenance landscaping, any type of renovation, any type of addition, etc. You want to keep records for all of that. And again, if you've owned your house for 30 or 40 years and you're going to sell your home, you want to make sure that you've got, I'll say, information to support your cost basis. Otherwise, you can end up being in a situation where you end up paying tax on a gain. Basically, as a single person, you can actually have $250,000 of gain when you sell your house. As a married couple, $500,000 a gain. And if you go over that limit and you can't support, like, I'll say, additional cost-based items, you're going to pay tax on it. Homeowners insurance policies, generally just the last policy. So if you haven't really updated your policy and they send you a new policy every year, just save the last one. Mortgage payoff documentation. This is something that we see frequently that ends up being an issue. Somebody pays off their house and then later on, they come back in and take a home equity loan on their house for whatever reason, maybe home improvements, or again, pay off bills, whatever it may be. At times when they're trying to take out the home equity line, they have a problem with the new lender saying that, oh, we don't have any documentation that you've paid off the house, and they can't find the prior lender because a lot of the lenders have consolidated. So keep that in mind. Next slide, Jason.
Yeah, I was just going to, a quick sidebar on the valuables in the house, right? And kind of the homeowner's insurance. Just kind of think through, like, oh, do I kind of have some special, valuable assets in the house, whether it be art or antiques or, furniture, jewelry, etc. And I know a lot of the homeowners policies, they'll have a simple, like, little checklist, to just kind of get an inventory of that, make sure you have the proper coverages there, but also just it's just a helpful, inventory summary of, oh, these are the valuable assets that if something happened in the house, you'd be able to have the proper coverage kick in for those.
When it comes to personal tax records, the general rule is just keep it 7 years. If you look it up, you actually at times only need to keep returns 3 to 6 years. Now, of course, if it's held digitally now, you generally just keep it forever because it just will make it that much more convenient if you ever do need to pull it out. But for the most part, the longest you ever really need to keep tax records is 7 years for your personal income tax returns. So I personally have shredded old paper copies. I'll keep about 7 years and get rid of them. And so it's every couple of years when I go through that, I'll say when my pile gets too big of the old tax records, I'll throw away some of the old ones and shred them. But I would also tell you, when it comes to your income tax returns, you want to keep the supporting documents with the return. So for example, with your 2018 tax return, it'd be good to have all of the supporting tax records that you used to prepare the 2018 tax return with it. So, back in the days when I did tax work, we would give somebody an envelope of all the records they gave us that we used to prepare the tax return, and we would just keep it with the return. And that's generally W-2s, 1099s, mortgage interest statements, K-1s, and I'll say support for your Schedule A, which is your miscellaneous itemized deductions, charitable contributions, real estate taxes, medical expenses. So you want to keep all of those type of things, and documentation used for sale of securities, etc. Again, just put it in an envelope and save it with the return. But after 7 years, essentially, really no real reason to keep them.
Under the new, I'm going to call it, I know it's a few years old now with the tax law, right, where they increased the standard deductions. Even though you may still be given to charity, you may not be itemizing anymore. You know, you may be accustomed to keeping all those, but it's not really relevant if you didn't itemize that year.
Great point, thanks. So on the business side of it, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a larger business and you've got employees, generally you've got a fiduciary responsibility to maintain your books of records, but you see on the screen a list of things that you should always be keeping, like articles of incorporation, the organization papers, business permits and licenses, tax returns, again, for 7 years. And if it's a large organization, again, I would probably just talk to your CPA about what they're recommending these days. And if you had the same CPA, likely they've got the records in a digital format since they've been working with you. Employment tax returns, as Jason mentioned, we're actually cleaning up our office right now, renovating our office. And I actually am tasked with cleaning up some of those records for the business. And so I'm actually cleaning out some of the old employment tax returns that we've had for 8 or 9 years that we really don't need to keep anymore. Business, I'll say purchase and sale of assets. So if you owned your office, things like that, you'd want to keep those type of records. Same thing when I talked about paying off a mortgage, but if you've got business loan records and verification of loan satisfaction, you want to make sure you keep them until you're 100% confident it's not going to come back to haunt you. So you've gotten rid of the equipment that was secured by the loan. And you also want to keep records of accounts receivable to make sure that you can verify who owes you money. And so if you've got some, I'll say people that have worked with you for 10 or 15 years and you've got a long receivables list, sometimes you'll have to go back to some of the older years to make sure you've accounted for things properly. Jason?
Yeah, very good. All right, so just a few kind of additional miscellaneous records to save. So kind of going back to focus on the personal records for a moment, here's some additional documents you will want to hold on to or have a digital file of. And generally, these are the kinds of things that you'd want to just keep long term or while they're still relevant, I'll say, right? And so just kind of diving into that a little bit. So, insurance policies, good example. I think Al mentioned this a little bit, right? So you really just need to keep the documentation for any active policies, right? If there's old policies that have expired or just, aren't in play anymore, there's really no reason to keep documents on those. One of them that we still see a little bit here, it's getting rarer and rarer, is like physical stock or bond certificates, right? So if you have the physical certificate, honestly, like the best thing to do in terms of just kind of getting things cleaned up and not running the risk of it getting destroyed or lost, right, is to get it deposited, into a brokerage account, right? And we've helped clients with that over the years. They'll say, oh, hey, we have some old physical stock certificates, and there's a process, right, of just getting it endorsed and getting it deposited into your account, and that way it gets tracked with all of your other investments. Pension documentation is an interesting one. It doesn't apply to everybody, but it's kind of especially important to have sort of the records, whether you're a federal employee, right, state employee, or private employee who has a pension. If something were to happen to you kind of before the pension benefits kick in, right, that's one kind of scenario, right? If you were to pass away, to make sure you have that documentation available, and your significant other family would be able to know, one, that you have that benefit, right, and two, how to access what kind of survivor benefits might come into play there. But then I'll say, even if you're in retirement, right, and you've already made a pension election, just keeping track of, oh, did I elect a survivor option on there, right? Or is there in some pensions, there's a cash payout, right, if someone passes away within a certain period of times, right? So another kind of important record to hang on to. Things like marriage licenses, divorce degrees, birth certificates, adoption papers. Those are things that good examples of physical forms you want to hang on to forever, right? But also have a digital backup of them, right? A great thing, just have a scanner. I know, I still have, one of these big clunky kind of scanners at home, but I know Dennis in our office mentioned, like, you could just there's scanner apps you can just have on your phone, right? If you just need to scan a handful of documents, right, that you can do that as well, right? To have that digital backup of some of those kinds of kind of documents. I purposely sort of skipped over legal estate documents on this list. We're going to dive into that in a little more detail later in the presentation.
And I'll add one thing, like
Yeah.
on miscellaneous records to keep. At times when you're in a store and they say, hey, do you want to join whatever club we have? And basically they're trying to track your records for you, what you're buying. At first you might say, I don't want them to know more about me, but I'll say when you're in a place like Home Depot and Lowe's and they have those type of things, and it might be something you might return down the road, I would tell you joining those clubs really is nice because they'll save what your purchases were. And so once again, you could walk out of the store and pretty much throw away the receipt.
Or just not even printed out, right? Because they've got it all
Correct.
saved for you. Yeah. Yep. So just kind of picking on a few things that you don't need to keep, right? And I want to go back and emphasize something that Alp mentioned here is right, we're really talking about kind of personal items here. And I know Alp talked a lot about some of the house related items. There's an important distinction also if you have rental properties, right? Like I have had rental properties in the past, and there's an important distinction between some of the receipts to keep. Hey, if it's relevant to the business, right, of being a rental owner versus just kind of your personal kinds of records. But this first one's a great example, right? Just sort of the personal utility, internet, phone bills. Hey, if it's related to a rental property, you need to hang on to those because they're supporting documents for the business. But personally, no need to keep old utility statements. This is one of those areas I used to hang on to all that stuff. I think Alp, you said you used to hang on to all that stuff at one point. I think now I've tried to go paperless on all that, so they just don't even get it in the mail. Right, anything I can, I try to just set up auto pay. Right, so it just pays a lot of those utility bills automatically. But if you have old paper statements just shred them. There's no, well, what about if just shred them?
I'll say with that one exception we've talked about, if you have home office expenses and you're writing it off on your taxes.
Related to the business, yep.
Yeah, so related to the business, you would generally keep something, but for 99% of the people, I would just tell you, there's really no reason to save a lot of the records that you've saved.
Right. And even to those business records, all that stuff's available online. Right, the utility bills, the phone bills, you can log into your accounts for those and get those statements, right, if you needed them. Paycheck stubs, no reason to hang on to those old ones, right? Just all you really need is that W-2, right, or 1099s that Alp already talked about. And plus, most of these companies have those all online, right? If you ever, for whatever reason, needed to get to them. Receipts, Alp talked about those, right? Don't really need them. One of the things that I've gotten rid of a lot recently is owner's manuals. They're all available online, right? If you ever say, well, what about my refrigerator or my washer dryer or whatever it is, if you ever need to reference it, you can go online and get the actual owner's manual, or just search on YouTube and someone will walk you through whatever you need if you're trying to fix something or find the right part or anything along those lines. Further, kind of with this theme, if you haven't gotten it already, of going digital, just making sure you get the proper storage. Okay, we're gonna talk about that, right? Like, we have with our business, we have proper kind of protocols and security that we've taken into account for the business storage, right? But just kind of focusing on the personal side of things, we'll talk about some of the different options that are out there. But obviously, making sure you have the proper storage. There are free options, there are pay options. We've already sort of talked about why going digital, right? It just makes your life so much easier, so much quicker to find things. You can search, right? It's so much easier. We talked about having a scanner, encryption. If anybody is unfamiliar with that, right? There's ways to both encrypt communications, right? If you're sending something over email, to make sure that nobody can sort of get it while it's in transit, right? There's ways of encrypting to keeping things safe, or while you save things, whether you're using the different sort of cloud services that are out there. Right, they all use different kinds of forms of encryption to protect, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But also, just I'll back up to the analog examples, right? Well, Jason, you did say to keep things like marriage certificates, right, and birth certificates, divorce decrees in physical form. If you have a fireproof lockbox at home, that's a great sort of thing to have, right? Just say, hey, these things that I know I need to keep in physical form, that's a great way to just keep them in the house, right? In a lockbox that's fireproof.
Or you can pay for a safe deposit box at a bank. We don't see that as often as
All right.
people did in the old days, but
Yep.
something to think about.
Yep. So on that theme, right, we sort of talked about it, right? The classic cabinet with a file folder. I think our goal, right? My goal personally is to get rid of that eventually. Like I said, I still have a small one. The fireproof lockbox we talked about, safety deposit box we talked about. If you think about it, right, the digital, everything is sort of like the organization of a physical file cabinet, right? But just in a digital format, right? Or you can but now it's so much easier to just type search. I need to find my 2018 tax file, to help you find those things. Just a few examples, right? So Google Drive is probably the most popular, most well-known out there form of kind of going digital and keeping all these documents. Dropbox is another one that's been out for many years that I think some folks are familiar with. There are others, Apple has a service, but those are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're saying.
And I think it's important to remind people to stick with, I'll call it, a major brand that has the bankroll to be in business for the next 50 years. And so you don't have like a small fly-by-night organization that basically just closes up shop and, hey, where are your records?
Right. All right. And just like have, backups, it's really easy to have digital backups in different places, but it's prudent too, right? Like, so I know what gets some people into trouble is they say, oh yeah, I'm all digital, it's on my computer at home. Well, what happens if that computer crashes, right, or gets destroyed in a fire or flood, right? Well, do you have it backed up on the cloud, right? And that's really where everything is going, and that's what like a Google Drive or a Dropbox is having it backed up, on the cloud. So now just kind of thinking through some of the best practices of disposing of paper, right? We've been encouraging you to get rid of things that you don't need. Right. The best thing is leveraging a cross shredder, right? So not just the old fashioned one where it cuts it in strips, right? But that kind of really truly destroys it, where nobody could kind of piece it back together. That's kind of the best way, rather than, just tossing it in the recycling bin, right? But if you cross shred it, then you can recycle that. I even heard somebody recently say that, oh, they compost their shredded paper, which is kind of cool. But there's also services out there, right? I think UPS, different copier, kind of the physical copier places, you can bring in stacks of paper and they'll do big bulk cross shredding for you. I think there are community shred days, probably not so much this past year, but that's a fairly common thing you might see in your neighborhood or in your community, where you can bring all that stuff and they'll dump it in a big industrial cross shredder, be done with it. But now, right, if we're really talking about going digital with things, you have to really kind of think about, well, gosh, I have things, I've backed it up on a hard drive in my house, right? Or I've backed it up on a computer in my house, and now I'm going to the cloud. What should I do with these hard drives that I have? I just don't need those anymore. Well, you want to be careful, right, about not just tossing those, right? Somebody could get that and get your information, right? So honestly, the best thing to do is shred them, and there are really industrial shredders, right? That take electronics and shred those. I know a lot of the community shred days, that's just the norm now. Best Buy still out there. You can go into there. I know they offer that. There are other places that do that. Some of the other tips are, people will say, oh, you want to kind of factory reset the old laptop, the old hard drive, right? Just kind of wipe everything clean. And before you shred it, right? Just some simple tips there. All right, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit here and sort of talk about navigating the digital world, right, in your online accounts. And this can be cumbersome, right, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. I think the number one thing that we sort of hear from folks is you have to have passwords for everything, right? and I'm sure some of you on this call have that slip of paper, right, where you've got all your your sites, your logins, your passwords written down on that piece of paper, and And I'll say that probably some of you also are guilty of using the same password for a lot of different sites, right? And when I say guilty of that, that is a big no-no. And let's sort of talk about that. One of the most kind of common and simple sort of hacks, right, that people will do is they'll break into a low secure kind of website, right? Like just like a simple retailer, right? Not the banks and credit cards, they have high security, right? But there's various levels of security out there, right? And so these hackers will attack some of the simple low sites, and they'll get your login and password, and then they'll just assume that, what, I bet you they use these same logins and passwords for this person's bank or credit card. So you can sort of see how risky that is to keep using, right, the same simple kind of passwords across things. So that's one of the biggest tips is around passwords, always using unique, strong passwords. But now you're saying, gosh, how do I remember all those? And I've really got to write all these down on my piece of paper. Well, that's not super secure either, right? What if somebody got that slip of paper? You didn't want to have that slip of paper, right? I'm not saying, I'm not trying to freak anybody out, right? But things happen, and that slip of paper could get misplaced. Somebody could simply take a picture of it, right? And wow, now they've got all your passwords. So what I'm driving towards is something that changed my life. It was one of those moments a few years back when both in our office and personally, I started using a password manager. And what that is, and I'm just going to do a Cliff Notes summary on what these are, and happy to follow up. There's some good articles out there, and we can share additional information, but just kind of the basic idea is that these are companies, that operate online. Apple has a service, Google has a service, a couple of the other kind of independent companies that are reputable, that have been around a long time. LastPass is one. There's one called 1Password. But basically what they do is they help you generate and use unique, strong passwords, right, that use numbers, characters, uppercase, lowercase, and you don't even need to keep track of what it is, right? So they'll generate it, plug it into the site for you, and then save it in the password manager program. And so then you just need to establish a strong master password, right, that to log into that password manager. And then when you go to your various sites that prompt you need to fill in, the password manager will fill in the unique password and logins that have been created. For the folks that are kind of extra cautious, they might say, well, you know what, for my really, really important sites, think the financial related things, right? Credit cards, banks are good examples. They'll say, what, I'm not going to put those in the password manager, and I'm just going to keep those separate. But just remember, make sure you have really strong, unique passwords for those. But for all of your other sites, boy, I cannot recommend enough making your life so much easier, using a password manager. And I'm going to kind of circle back to that and how that can be a helpful tool in kind of estate issues and planning as well in a little bit.
Interesting. I don't remember the beginning if you asked anybody if they had questions and how they would actually throw it in, because I know we haven't gotten any questions. But
I know we did get one in advance. But yeah, I know good reminder. I know some folks kind of signed on late. Just as a quick reminder, if any questions, comments along the way, you can type them in using either the Q&A pop-up box or dialog box or the chat box. Either one works. We'll keep an eye on there. So if anybody has any questions, comments at any point, please type those in. I know we did get one that I'm holding off on addressing when I think it's going to be kind of most relevant with what we're talking about. Let's see. Okay, keeping your online accounts safe. Been kind of talking about this a little bit, right? The most important thing, the passwords, right? I won't belabor that, right? But just, when I keep using the term strong, right? So let me clarify that. Just no dictionary words, right? Don't just like use the kids' names, right? Those kinds of things. You know, you want it to be minimum 8 characters, have numbers in it, have special characters, uppercase, lowercase, right? And that's again where those password managers can be really invaluable, because they'll just generate random strong passwords for you, and save those in. One of the other features that has become really the norm, that any site you set up nowadays will ask you to set up what's called two-factor authentication or two-factor authorization. So some of you may not be totally familiar, not quite fully understand what that means. Is it basically just says, okay, in addition to having to fill in the username and password to get into the site, you can, and they can say, oh, someone from a different computer is trying to log in, and even if they had the correct password and login, that site will say, hey, you need to have a second authorization, so a second point of confirmation, if you will. Most common tool is that you would enter and have your cell phone on file. Then they'll text you a code. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this. So then in addition to the login, the password, you get that text that's only good for about usually 5 or 10 minutes. Then you type that in. Another form of security that we highly recommend. Set that up anytime it's offered, take it and utilize it. I'll also say kind of consolidating different accounts that are out there. This is one of the things that we see often, is whether it be old 401k plans, or just multiple bank accounts, or brokerage accounts across different brokerage firms, multiple credit cards, right? Like, simplify your life, and through that process of simplifying your life, consolidating into fewer things, there's sort of less points of risk out there, right? So definitely recommend that kind of simple step as well. All right, so let's move here a little bit. Preparing your next of kin, right? And I know we did have a question come in, that was related to an old estate, right? Somebody's parent had passed away many years back, and the question was sort of how long should they keep, right? Sort of the different documents related to the closing of that estate. And Alp, I don't know if you want to kind of jump on that first, sort of talking about like the tax returns, just sort of building on what you'd already talked about, and some of those supporting documents.
Well, I guess if the estate's been closed, if it's been closed for 7 years, I'll just say I can't see any reason that they're going to dig into it. And I'll jokingly say, unless you're a past president of the United States and they're looking at your parents, what your dad left you, I think that has gone back a lot more than 7 years. But for any type of normal situation, and I'll say specifically, if it wasn't a taxable estate, then it's 7 years and you're done.
Yep. Pretty straightforward. And I also want to kind of point out a distinction too around different sites and the security, sort of things to keep in mind, especially with sort of financial sites. There are what I'll describe as kind of active sites, where you can, once you're logged in, you can do things, right? Like you could move money, right? Push money out and pay bills, right? So, your bank account site, right, is a great example of that. Then there are what I will describe as kind of read-only sites, right? Where yes, you still want it to be secure, but if somebody did log in, yes, they'll be able to see your information, but they can't actually do anything with it, right? They can't move money from it. So it's just one of those things to always kind of to just distinguish between, like, oh, okay, truly the most important ones are the ones where money could be moved, right? Action could be taken within that, versus just sort of that read-only environment.
And what's your recommendation for basically if somebody's trying to prepare the next of kin, like when it comes to the password manager? Would you give somebody access to that so they could find where everything is?
Yeah, let's talk about that. But I'm going to pause for a moment, because we had a follow-up on your comment. A question was, what is a taxable estate? Al, you made that sort of point of clarification.
So currently the threshold is really high, but so the number's around 23 plus $1 million for a married couple and half of that for a single individual. So if somebody's estate was not at that level and they died in 2020, you only have to keep those records for 7 years max. If it's a taxable estate, meaning that somebody had a $50 million estate, and so there was taxes paid, and say if it was complicated, I would talk to your accountant and say, is there any reason to keep it past 7 years? For the most part, I'm going to say the answer is no, but I would just listen to the accountant's advice now. I'll safely say that it's been a long time since I've taken my CPA continuing education. So I'll defer to what the current accountants are saying.
Um, all right, thanks. So now kind of back to the preparing your next of kin, right? Like thinking about estate documents and so forth. One, I'll just say, no matter what your age, it's always good to have someone who knows where your assets are and kind of where your important documents are, right? I know some folks sort of refer to this as sort of like a what if checklist, right? What if something happened to you? I know here at AFS, we sort of refer to it with our clients as just in case, call AFS, all right? Because we generally, have a lot of the information, readily available to help a next of kin, right, if need be, right? And then also kind of who are sort of some of the important points of contact, right? Your accountant, the estate attorney, if there's important banking relationships, right? Kind of having that information, kind of all together, and perhaps sharing that with, your next of kin or loved one. The summary of assets or accounts. And then thinking to Alp's earlier point, sort of what's the system that you have in place to kind of transition if you're no longer able to handle kind of your finances or your business affairs, so this is a point to what Alp was talking about, back to kind of the password managers and how this can be a useful tool. So one, you can set it up for a loved one to where you can both share, right? So like my wife and I have the same account, the password manager that we use. So we could, either of us could log in, and we each have our secure password, log in and utilize it. So that actually took a lot, some of the stress off of my mind, thinking like, gosh, if something happened to me, Beth doesn't, that would be a pain in her rear to try to figure out how to get logged into all the relevant sites, right? So that's really helpful. But then you might say, gosh, I don't necessarily want maybe my kids yet to have access to all my stuff, but I would like them to know how they could get access to it if I was unable, right? If I had an accident, became disabled, right? Alzheimer's, dementia, is a reality, right? To kind of think about. And so I know a lot of these password managers will have a function that says you've sort of given someone authorization, all right, and then that person can submit a request to say, hey, I think, mom or dad, it's time for me to start having access. So they can submit a request, and then it's usually like a week or 2 weeks that you can either deny it, to say like, no, I'm fine, you don't need to be in here yet, or if you don't do anything, then their functionality will turn on. Right, and you, from a practical perspective, I can see where, I'm going to get that set up. I don't have it set up yet with my parents, right? To make sure that, hey, let's get you guys all set up with the password manager, but then give me and my sister permissions, right, to be able to help you if something happens to you, to get into those accounts. Another kind of practical sort of reason for utilizing some of those password managers, because in the past, the common thing was, if mom or dad passed away, well, you just wait at the mailbox and see the statements come in to figure out like what they have. But a lot of people have gone paperless. Statements don't get mailed anymore, right? So it is really dependent on the passwords, right, and being able to log into things.
And basically just giving somebody at some point an accounting of not only where everything is, but I'll just say like various values. And I realize you start touching the subject of when somebody's ready for that, but it's important for somebody to know where all the assets are, and as Jason said, like where the passwords are, and just really a strong accounting of everything.
Yep. So just talking about the estate documents specifically for a moment, make sure that anyone you have named with a power in your estate should have a copy, or at least access to these documents, right? So for example, in your will, you name an executor, right? So the executor should have copy or access. In your trust, if you have a trust, if you've named someone as a trustee or a successor trustee in a lot of cases, make sure they know that they've been named, right? And they have a copy of the document or access to the documents. Powers of attorney, whether it be financial decisions, healthcare decisions, same thing applies. For a lot of folks, it's actually the same person who sort of has been appointed to fill all those roles, so it makes kind of things simple in that regard. But in other cases, it's not uncommon to say, hey, I've named one person to kind of be responsible for financial related items and another person to kind of be responsible for healthcare related items, right? So make sure then you have digital backups of all the estate documents. Anyway, that's becoming more and more the norm, right? Estate attorneys, they craft all the documents in digital form, right? So they have them saved in digital form, but make sure you have access to the digital forms, and then that's an easy way to share with the important people in your life. One kind of quick note on the medical power of attorney. So a lot of times, like if you have a local hospital that you would go to, some of those hospitals have their own specific kind of medical power of attorney form. So in addition to kind of the generic one that an estate attorney would help you with, you might just ask them, hey, what forms do you have specifically that I need to sign that you have on file, that, hey, if I come in, incapacitated, that you have on file that so-and-so has powers, right, to help make financial or medical decisions on my behalf. So another thing that comes up oftentimes is beneficiary designations, and as I'm sure many of you are familiar, right, retirement accounts, you have beneficiary designations. 401ks, IRAs, life insurance policies have beneficiary designations. Annuities have beneficiary designations. And as hopefully if something happens to you, that asset that has a beneficiary designation passes outside of the will. The beneficiary designation supersedes, right? So that will go to who you've named, or maybe it's a charity, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, right? But whoever you have named in that beneficiary designation, right? If you have assets titled in a trust, then the trust dictates how those assets will pass upon your will go upon your passing. And then anything else that doesn't have a beneficiary designation or is titled in a trust basically falls under the power of your will, right? So what you have in your will. Okay, hopefully that's just a refresher for everybody. But one of the things that a lot of folks don't realize is for the accounts that maybe you don't have a trust, right? And so that's not relevant. And for accounts that don't naturally have a beneficiary designation, you can add a beneficiary designation, such as what's called a TOD or POD, transfer on death or payable on death. And in some instances, that can kind of help make life and death easier, right, for all parties involved. You might say, hey, I have an individual investment account, for example, that's just in my name, and if something were to happen to me, it would go through the probate process and pass via my will, which kind of slows down the process of getting it to the next generation. You may say, hey, it's appropriate for me to just add a beneficiary designation on that through a TOD or POD registration. For any of our clients, that's something happy to talk to you about. It doesn't apply in all situations, right? You want to make sure it's coordinated before you add that. It's coordinated within your overall estate plan, right? That it's not, your TOD designation isn't necessarily contradictory to what you've written in your will, right, or what you have in your trust documents. But in kind of simple estates, it can be a really nice tool, function to use. So I know we had a question related to kind of the AFS site and talking about two-factor authentication. One of the points that I made earlier, the AFS site, for any of our clients that you log in, you probably already know that's a read-only site, right? So when you log in, you can just see, or if someone were to hack in, right, they would only be able to see information. They can't move information, all right? But specifically, the question is, does that site have two-factor authentication? And I'm sheepish to say that I don't believe our home office has yet added two-factor authentication on that. Yeah, I know it's something we've talked to them about. why not? But we feel a little bit better in knowing that it's just a read-only site. And we have a lot of internal protocols that, hey, if somebody tried to email us impersonating you or tried to call us impersonating you, right? We have a lot of different protocols that we follow in that case. So appreciate the question, and I know it's something that we continually have been pushing our home office to say, why not make it two-factor? So appreciate that. And great. I think we are wrapping up. I don't know, Alp, if you had any kind of
I
additional.
don't. Did you go over the, I'll call it the PDF that's available that summarizes some of this?
Yeah, I mentioned it at the beginning, so I'll mention it again. So we have a nice simple kind of handout. It'll be in digital form, appropriately enough, that as a part of our follow-up, you'll get a link to the recording and also a handout that kind of summarizes a lot of what we talked about. Kind of a simple checklist that says these are the things to keep, things that you don't need to keep, and so forth. If anybody's interested in learning more about password managers or anything else we talked about, please reach out to us. Happy to connect or set up a time to talk. We have a YouTube page with a lot of recordings of our previous workshops. The links here on the screen right now, so please feel free to hop on there. Feel free to share with any friends or loved ones that you have. And without further ado, great, we're coming in under an hour. That was our goal here. So appreciate everybody joining us today. Here's our team, our Alp and my contact information. Feel free to reach out at any point with any questions or comments. And thanks for joining us. Have a great day. Get outside and enjoy this beautiful weather.
And stay safe as always.
All right, take care.
Bye.